I'm Becky here with Nate28 and this is Crossbeats Production. This tutorial is about compression, and I want to go into a little bit in depth of why to use compression, how to use compression, why would you even want to use a compressor, and just explain to, I guess, not so much the expert people out there, but more of the novice people, and get them to understand people that are just starting out beat making, and get them to understand what a compressor is and why do you reach for a compressor and how do you understand even when to do that. I know when I first started out, and that was probably maybe 6 years ago now, maybe even less, I'm not too sure, it's approximately 6 years. But I know when I first started out, I never could understand that, why do these people seem to reach for this compressor in this certain area? Like, why on this particular instrument do they put a compressor on it? And what are they doing it for on their drums? And what are they trying to achieve? There's certain things that you just learn over time, and I've learned over time, and I know other people or other mix engineers out there have learned over time, and listening to your music and listening to other people's music and understanding where they put certain things and how they apply to EQ to one thing and how they apply to compressor to another. It really is not that difficult once you sort of get a grasp of what you're listening for and what you're trying to achieve. I guess the main thing is with compressors in general is that when you're compressing your music, say it be your drums or your piano or your synth or whatever it is that you're compressing, the creativeness behind that is really why you do it in the first place. It's not about so much, just using a compressor just for the sake of having it there and putting it on it. You're really just doing it because at the end of the day, you're wanting your music to sound creative, and you're wanting it to have body, you're wanting it to have rhythm. I've found, especially with compressors, that if you set a compressor right, you can get the track to really breathe how it's supposed to be breathing when you're creating that music. This is really just, I want to make it a short tutorial so you guys could get a first grasp. This will probably be a part, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 of compression. But I really want to show you what it's like to put a compressor on, say for example, drums, because this is what I've got as an example right now, and why I would reach for a compressor when I'm putting it on a set of drums, or why I wouldn't reach for a compressor on a set of drums. This particular drum kit or thing that I've just made up, it's really simple. It's just a kick and a snare and a hi-hat. So I'll just play to you the beat, and I'll just mute I'll just mute the instruments that I've just introduced now so it doesn't interrupt with what I'm trying to show you. Alright, so let me just play this basic beat to you and you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, first off, I've got a couple of things going on. Now, one thing is I've got the mix in mono, okay? So this is my personal way of mixing. You don't have to follow it if you don't want to, but I personally mix in mono because in my room that I'm in, for one, it doesn't cause issues with my room because it's in stereo. Say the sound is already bad enough when it's in stereo, it's bouncing off the walls and it's going all over the place. I like to listen to things in mono because it's definitely a lot more focused. Especially when I'm doing the mix and I'm listening to things that I'm trying to critique, I find that it's a lot easier to hear things in mono and hear the problems in your mix in mono. And apart from that, you're gaining, and this is not a rule, like I said, but apart from that, you're gaining the mono compatibility in your mix early on, so you don't have to worry about that later on if that's what you're chasing later on in the mix. Okay, now that we've got mono out of the way, save your comments for another video. I don't really care about your comments on whether or not you want to say it's bad to have it in mono or good or whatever. That's not the purpose of this video. But anyway, so basically, the next thing is I had a compressor on the mix bus. I don't know if you saw on here, it was compressing a little bit of signal. It was very minimal though, but I was getting some compression. And I'll just show you the purpose of why I put it on the mix bus at the start of the mix, or close to the start of the mix. Normally what I would do for the mix bus is I would pull the threshold all the way back up to 0, so it's not compressing the signal whatsoever, and it's not affecting the way that the sound of the beat is that I'm making. Once I get to a certain place in the beat and the actual beat's starting to come together, so say I've got that kind of sound, and I've got a synth, I've got some bass, I've got a kick and a snare, and I've got other instruments, piano, whatever they might be in there. Once I've got the basics of that, that's when I introduce the compressor. Look, there's another video I want to do just purely on gain staging and describe exactly behind the gain staging process. And just really, at the end of the day, you're just trying not to clip your mix. That's the basics of creating a beat and understanding the gain staging process. There are other things you want to aim for within the gain staging. And when I say gain staging, I'm talking about the loudness of your individual tracks here. So say for example my kick is minus 15, okay? Say it's at minus 15 dB. That's no set rule by thumb or anything like that. That's just what I aim for, because I tend to use compressors that mimic the original compressors, like an SSL bus compressor. That's the type of compressors that I use on my mix. I do use these stock compressors sometimes to get certain sounds because they just work. And there's nothing wrong with these compressors that are built into Studio One, because they definitely work. It's just that I aim for other sounds and I try to be creative with my beats. But for an example, when I say I use the replicas, this particular compressor here is one of the compressors I would use. So I would then set the threshold all the way up to plus signal, so it's not going to interfere with my signal in the first place. Pull the makeup gain all the way down to 0, so I'm not getting an increase in volume. Set my release times to whatever I want it to be. So usually I'd set it at auto at the start, or as fast as possible, so 0.1. I'll just set it to auto for now, sorry. And then I would use the amount, so the ratio. So that could be either 2, 4, or 10. Usually on the bus, you go for less is more. That's the trick that I tend to go for. So for an example, let me just play this beat. So as you can see, when I pull this threshold down all the way to minus 15, you can see that the compressor works a little bit different than this compressor here, for example. So the difference between the two, just so I can explain to you, hang on, let me just get this off the bus and just show you these two side by side. So as you can see, if I drag this down to minus 15, close to it anyway, I'll just type it in. All right, so minus 15 we've got both set at the same threshold, and I'll turn one or the other on. So as you can see, extremely minimal compression, hardly anything's happening right now. Turn this one on. Okay, so they're both compressing closely to the same amount. But as you can tell, on this compressor here, the SSL, it doesn't go anything past minus 15. Now, the reason why it's set up like this is because this particular SSL bus compressor, that's how the console was set up with this the threshold gain in that way. So the fashion that this was set up was to replicate the same kind of gain structure as that original console or that compressor would have had. Now, this has no rule of thumb on gain structure because it's set to alter any signal within this DAW. So you can drag this, say I'll turn this back on, you can drag this all the way down to minus 48 dB. It obviously doesn't go that far down because your signal isn't going to be that low in volume generally, but normally you'd set your signal to whatever, threshold that you want it to be at to adequately compress your input signal. So when people look at gain staging within the DAW, the digital audio workstation, they're not thinking so much about the fact that, I've got to have a higher signal as I can to avoid floor noise, which this compressor would have had originally in that console when it first came out or when it's being used. Consoles or electronic equipment have what they say floor noise. So that's a certain noise that comes into the console. So I'll show you by example. This compressor, sorry, not compressor, this setup here introduces noise. So if I put noise on, you can see that the more I increase that, the more noise that I have. So at the bottom of this console, you can see that there's now floor noise. That's basically the noise that you generally would see in a console or a electronic equipment console like that. The old-fashioned consoles or any type of console that's not DAW. Just to give you an example, that's kind of what you would try and aim above, so you're not just on floor noise. So most of the time, just to make sense with what I'm saying here, is most of the time with a console, people have a certain amount of floor noise that they try and get above that noise of silence, because generally there's no actual silence within the console that's making noise, because the electronic components make noise. Everything within that console is making noise, the capacitors, all that sort of stuff. So you don't have to face that issue within the DAW per se in this setting. The DAW doesn't have floor noise unless you're obviously turning on the console shaper, which has floor noise then, because it's creating that emulation of that same kind of console and that same noise that it generates. So off track a little bit, but I just want to explain to you that, when you're using a standard compressor, say for example the one that comes in this DAW, this compressor here is going to be set in a different threshold to this SSL compressor. So let's just close that off. I won't worry about explaining that too much further, but I just want to give you guys an example of what I'm talking about when you're looking at other compressors. Like Waves make compressors like an SSL, UAD make compressors, which is the one I've just shown you. Other companies make compressors that are emulating that same type of compressor structure. Even Native Instruments make one as well. But anyway, so let's get into what it looks like to compress a signal and how do you choose whether or not you're compressing the signal or not. So I'll just quickly mute all of this stuff here so I don't have it play whilst I'm trying to do this. So let's just solo what we've got going here. So first off, these are the drums, no compression at all, and I'll just play them to you so you can hear it first. Okay, so as you can see, the compressor isn't working on this. There's no compression. The transients, and when I talk about transients, I'm talking about this marker here. So say for example, let's just zoom in a bit just so you can see what it looks like. So this is the transient of that signal. So actually this is a better way of showing you. So the transient's this first loudest part here. The transient then sustains further down to complete silence. So if you're looking at the transient of a kick or a snare or whatever it is that you're, even a vocal has a transient. It's a bit different to the way a kick or a snare works, but it does have a transient. So that's the transient, and this is what the compressor affects the most. The transient's the loudest part of the signal, and then it decreases down until it gets to silence. So what a compressor does, so you understand, is a compressor will deal with the transient. It brings the transient, or it takes out the volume of a transient and brings the volume down closer to the lower volume part of that signal. So as you can see here, the next example I've got is a compressed signal. Now there's no makeup gain in this compressed signal, it's just compressed. There is a little bit lower volume of transient, and it's closer to the actual full signal of that kick or the snare or whatever it was in the first place. This is a compressed but made up gain signal. So I don't know if you can see the difference between the two, but the transient is a little bit louder. It's been pushed up a bit, and the signal itself is also a little bit louder. Well, actually, it's close to the same volume, but it is a tad bit louder because I've introduced makeup gain into that signal. So, why do you put a compressor on drums? Now, there's a couple of reasons. One would be to alter the sound of drums. This isn't just compression on drums, but any signal for that matter. It could be to alter the actual sound of it. It could be to, for example, bring up the reverb, because sometimes reverb naturally is on drums. The way that you record the drums, it might be in a room that has reverb bouncing off the walls, and that's recorded in the signal. So those drums, when you compress them, it might bring up the actual sound of that reverb, because the reverb is quite low. You can't hear it without the compressor added to it. But then when the compressor is on the signal, you can hear the reverb. So that's one thing that might happen when you compress the signal. The other thing is you might bring all the sounds together, make them cohesive. That's the other part of compression. When you're looking at a compressor and you're trying to introduce compression on a signal, you're just trying to make them sound like they're all supposed to be together and glue them together. That's one other thing that compression does. It glues things together. So let me just play. I'll just quickly make these smaller, and I'll just go through these signals. First off, the uncompressed, and then the compressed, and then the compressed with makeup gain. So let me just play these all together and in each step by step. So I'll just play them through each signal. So let's just go, and I'll just explain what's happening. So this is uncompressed signal. Compressed signal, no makeup gain. Uncompressed. Compressed. All right. The reason why I kept switching between the compressed and the uncompressed is to give you guys an example of what it sounds like when it's compressed and what it sounds like when it's not compressed. Now, do this in your own DAW as well. Go home and experiment. Go home and experiment with the sounds. Pardon me. Experiment with what it sounds like on your own drum mix or your own mix, because it really is hard to tell on the video, but what you're listening for is the transient and the way that the transient's affected on the compression. So I know I can hear it because I know what I'm listening for, but if you don't know what you're listening for, it's harder to hear. So I'll just play the uncompressed and the compressed signal in between each other, and I won't talk so you can hear it. Okay, where I hear that the most is the kick and the snare. No, it's not so much on the closed hi-hat, but more on the kick and the snare. It sounds like the kick is more cohesive with the snare and they're joint together, whereas without the compression, it sounded like they were in an airy sort of room. It didn't sound like they were really... It does, obviously they're together, but it doesn't sound like they're together in that sense, if you understand what I'm saying. And you can definitely hear the way that the transient's been affected with that compressor. The compression settings that I used, that I bounced out those two things, was 2:1, which is 2 dB in, 1 dB out. And the threshold was I think it was minus 34. I'm not too sure if that's the actual setting I used, but it must have been because I left it at that. The attack settings were 2.5, which is quite a quick attack. It's not extremely fast, and it's probably not the type of attack that you'd want to use on drums, but I did this for the dramatic way that affected the transient, so you could see. The release was at 120 milliseconds, and I left the gain or auto makeup gain on auto, so it increased the volume. Just so you know, this drum that I compress was getting about -7 dB compression, and I introduced 7 dB back into the compressed signal, so it made it even. So it's close to, and as you can see, let's zoom up a bit. Actually, I might just make this a little bit larger. Okay, so as you can see, the signal's quite similar on this blue one and the green one, but the way that the transient has been affected, you can see that it's evened out a bit with the rest of the transients on this signal. So the drums come closer together, and obviously the signal. So as you can see here, that's a good example. This little black speck, which now I can't see. There we go. So that little black speck there, I'll zoom in so you can see it. So that's a tiny little black speck which you can't see on the green one. And that tells you that whatever that noise was, that has increased in volume alongside everything else because of that showing on here. So I'll just make that a little bit larger. Alright, so you can see it now. You can see it on the uncompressed signal, and you can see it on the compressed signal, but the transient is most definitely more... Whoa! Come back here. Okay, so that little speck that I was talking about, you can see it's all here on these signals, but the transient has definitely increased in volume, and that's quite evident when you zoom in a bit more to see the differences between the two. But anyway, that's just one thing I want to show you guys. I want to just do a quick tutorial and really explain compression as best I could and as briefly as possible. This is a part 1. I might do even 5 parts of this series because there's definitely no way I can do all this explanation in one video. But anyway, just to give you guys an understanding of, first off, compression on drums. You know, hopefully it gives you an understanding of what compression looks like on your signal. And I also hope that it gives you an understanding of what compression sounds like. So if there's any questions, please hit me up in the comments. Don't hesitate to ask. It's really great that I can help and really be involved with you guys on this. And if there's anything else, let me know. Peace!